How do you get buy-in for a data science and machine learning project? This is suddenly a question I've been getting over the last month repeatedly. So what I want to talk to you about today is this concept of buy-in. And there's two sides to buy-in. One, there are the personalities, the people that are involved in their perspectives, almost like user personas. And on the other side is the business. Understanding both of these allows you to create a strategy to effectively get buy-in for your data science and machine learning projects. So let's dive right into the personas, the people who are going to have to buy in. And the first type of person is a worker. This is someone who's going to have to put in effort, who's actually going to have to do work in order for you to be successful with your data science project. And you have to understand their perspective is I'm pulled in a billion different directions and I have to pick the highest priority. So in order to get their buy-in, I have to make my project a priority. And that's one type of buy-in. And I'm competing for their attention with a lot of other priorities. The second type of buy-in is the one we typically focus on, which is decision makers. These are people who are going to have to say yes in one way, shape, or form in order for your project to get green lit and to go ahead and to get all the resources it needs, the workers. So we focus on decision makers, but we forget about all these other people that we also need to talk to and persuade. And when we think about decision makers, we're thinking, oh, this person is going to be the one who makes the decision. And that's not always true. Sometimes we're talking to a decision maker who is then going to talk to another decision maker, and they are all going to get together. And the communications that you need to do in order to give them your message and then persuade them to take your message up to the next level where they can finally get buy-in and approval for your project, well, that's a different type of buy-in and a different type of communication than you're probably used to. Now, consumers, who's going to use this thing that you're creating? Who's going to be the one who uses it and benefits from it? You need to evangelize benefits with them to turn them into evangelists for your project. And that leads straight into enablers. There are going to be groups of people who look at what you want to do as a data scientist and say, yes. And there's going to be natural alignment between their goals and your goals. And they're enablers. They're people who are going to help you sell your message, sell your product, because it ends up lining up with what their goals and what their job is to do. And so you've got these great enablers that you can take advantage of. Finally, you have adversaries. Just like there are people who are going to help you because your goals line up with theirs, there are people who are going to put barriers in your way because they don't see how your goals line up with theirs. You may be competing for resources with them. You're in a large company where agendas are all over the place, some personal, some organizational, and sometimes organizational goals conflict. And so there will be people who will be barriers to you getting your project approved. And so you have to figure out how to get around those barriers. Now that you understand the personalities, the people that you're going to be getting buy-in from and who in some cases are going to be obstacles to you getting buy-in, you also have to understand the business, because getting all of those personalities on your side, getting them all to say yes and commit their time to your project, setting yourself up for success, means you have to understand the business in order to communicate with those groups and individuals effectively and get buy-in. So what do you have to understand about the business? And I break it into two simple concepts. The first one, how does the business spend money? How does it make those decisions? Obviously, if you're trying to get budget, if you're trying to get buy-in, understanding how the business spends money and makes decisions about how to spend money is really important to you, because you're going to have to line your message up with how the business decides to spend resource, time, money, and everything else. So that's the first step in crafting your message, is understand that whole spending process and budgeting process. Second, how does a business make money? And that's huge, right? The business exists because someone's paying for things, typically a lot of things. And even in advanced businesses, you may have entire segments that truly don't understand why the customer pays them cash. And so for you to make a successful pitch for your project, you have to line up your message with revenue. And that takes a deeper understanding in many cases about how the business succeeds, how it generates revenue, than maybe even the business has, and even individual customer facing business units may have. And obviously, your data skills are going to come in huge here because you can go to the customer, you can gather data, and you can get a comprehensive picture of the business, both how it spends money and how it decides to spend money, and how it makes money. What do customers actually pay for? And this is, in a lot of cases, a great first place to start a data science project in a company that may not be accustomed to more complex, more advanced data science and machine learning projects, because insights are immediate. And at the same time, you're going to have to do this anyway. You are going to have to figure out the business in order to support your ideas and projects. So those are the two things about the business you have to understand. Now, why? Why do you have to understand those two things? And let's talk about, in business, what you think is a great big amount of money or a very interesting project may not be interesting to the business. Well, why? Because the business has finite resources. Again, how does it make decisions about spending money and allocating resources? Well, you have to understand what's interesting to the business. What is an interesting amount of money for them to save, where the business would get interested in that and say, huh, yeah, that's something that we're interested in doing, because those are the types of projects that you want to be pitching. They're more likely to succeed when it comes to cost savings or efficiency projects. Now, what's an interesting amount of revenue? What is that number that gets people, oh, yes, that's a project I want to hear more about? Because again, if you go for something that's too low value, you're not going to get the kind of interest that will support your project. You won't get a whole lot of enablers. There's not a lot of people that are going to care if the revenue amounts are too small. So that's really important to understand. And it comes from understanding how the business spends money and how the business makes money. Now you have an understanding of what your threshold is to get people's attention. And it's different at different companies. And so let me talk about how company size plays into creating interest and buzz, figuring out what gets the business interested enough to support you, to get that buy-in. And you got to understand, publicly traded companies, they will tell investors, here is how much we're going to make next quarter, next year. Here are the threats. Here are all of the opportunities that we see, our strengths and our weaknesses, and how we're supporting our weaknesses and getting rid of those. And this is a strategic presentation that they'll do quarterly to shareholders. Internally, they also have goals. They also have a strategy to achieve, in reality, a higher stock price. That's what the people at the very top of the organization are really most interested in. So what's made the stock move in the past? What sort of a revenue beat, or what sort of an increase in overall margins? And that talks specifically to how much of a cost savings would be interesting to them, and how much new revenue or how much incremental revenue would be interesting to them. So if you're in a publicly traded company, look at what has made the stock price go up. And you're probably looking at something that anyone in the C-suite, all the way up to that level, would go, oh, that's very interesting. Now, it's different in a startup, right? Startup is not necessarily publicly traded. So whose interest do you have to get? And that's usually the people who have invested money or who are going to invest money in the company. Look at what they are expecting. Look at what your investors expect, and look at when your company talks about what it's going to take to get that next series of fundraising. What does it take to make the VCs happy? You'll hear that a lot in startups. What is it going to take to continue to meet our targets? And that's what's important. Those are the numbers that you want to be shooting for. Typically, it's not so much cost savings in a startup as it is revenue and chasing revenue and being true to revenue. Whereas in larger institutional companies, cost savings can be significant because they increase margin. And those companies, especially in established, highly competitive marketplaces, margin's a big deal. Being able to compete on price is a huge deal. It's a competitive advantage. Whereas in a startup, you're not necessarily looking at the same thing when it comes to cost savings. Really, what you're chasing is revenue. And so be revenue focused and look at it from an investor's perspective. What is it that will build the company's valuation? What is it that will make an impact on the way VCs view this company as an investment? So that's a startup. Now, finally, you have family or privately held companies. And in this case, that's really difficult because now you're dealing with the opinions of a very small board. And those opinions may not always be data driven. They could be perception driven. And so in order to get those early projects green lit, you really have to pander to perception. There may not be any hard numbers behind what they're attempting to achieve, what they think is interesting. And so in this case, you really have to talk to people. You've got to understand in a privately held company, like I said, it's that board. And whatever the board thinks is important is what's important. Playing to perception's difficult, isn't it? For data-driven, it's like, wait, but that's just an opinion. Yes, but in this case, it's the opinion that's going to get your project funded. So pander to it because it opens doors for you. And when you show tangible improvements, tangible gains in revenue or significant cost savings, all of a sudden, what you're doing is driving perception. And so you can make some tangible forward progress, making even a privately held, board-run company more data-driven and more successful. So that's understanding the business. That's understanding the personalities. Now that you kind of have this understanding of what you need to know before you even build the pitch, well, now what? What else do you have to understand? Well, you have to understand the organizational chart. What you want to do is map the company. Understand who specifically you're going to be talking to. And you're creating a communication strategy across multiple organizations and to multiple personas in order to get buy-in for your data science and machine learning project. And in some companies, this is really easy. In a small startup with 80 people, that org chart's really simple. And everyone you need to interface with is probably pretty accessible. If you're in companies, like I've done companies that are over 10,000 employees, where meetings were sometimes hundreds of attendees. It's crazy. Trying to control that is it's nearly impossible. There are some very difficult org charts to map, but if you don't understand who you're talking to and who may be asking you questions and who you have to persuade, you end up in these meetings where there's 100 people and you don't have a chance because you can't tailor your message to more than 4 or 5 different groups, and you could have dozens represented. So you need to build an organizational chart that in a small company, like I said, it's very, very easy. Just look at the org chart. In a massive company, in a very large company, what you want to do is map director and up and build an organizational chart to understand and then categorize, whether they're a worker, are they a decision maker, are they enablers, and put them into each one of those buckets to figure out exactly what type of communication style you have to have with them. And now that you understand the business a little bit better, you're going to be able to tailor your message and create intentional communications with each one of those individuals and organizations that's more likely to get you buy-in, to get you approval from the people that you need to talk to. So you identify your key organizations, sort of those people under the director. And what do you need from each one of those organizations? Are they consumers? Are they enablers? Are they workers? Seriously, put them in buckets, label them, and understand each person, director and higher, and organization's agenda. What is their agenda? What are their objectives? Because in many cases, like I said, within a massive business, you can have different agendas and different objectives that support each other. And every once in a while, you have conflicting agendas and objectives. So lining up your message by really understanding your audience is critical. And now you're understanding your audience at a very granular level. So map out all of your projects now and say, okay, here are the projects I'd like to do. You don't have to pitch all of them at once, but obviously you probably have a couple of them, maybe a lot more than that you want to take on. But the best way to select what should I start with, what is the first thing that I'm going to do and get buy-in for, is the one with the path of least resistance, the one that aligns with your cost savings, this is interesting, or your revenue, this is interesting, that lines up with each one of your personas that you have the most organizations and individuals supporting. Those are going to be your first projects, the first things that you're going to target. And it may not be your big bang. Like you may have something bigger that you want to pitch first, but if it's got a harder road, if it's going to be harder to get buy-in, make that project second or third. Because if you can get one through and show an early win, if you can kind of get one that's easy to get everyone bought in on and show that early win, now you have credibility. So again, map out your projects, figure out based on all this research that you've done, which one's got the easiest road to yes, and do that one first and use that as a springboard. Plan ahead, think long term when it comes to buy-in. Now, okay, this is where it gets a little dense. To get buy-in, we are talking about something called complex collaborative decision-making under uncertainty. What does that mean? It's like we've talked about. There's a lot of personalities who are all going to be talking to each other and figuring out whether or not this project is going to happen. There's usually not just one person you have to get a yes from. It's usually a lot more than that. It can feel like all I got to do is convince this one person, the CTO, and I'm done. But it's never that easy because typically the end users, the consumers, or your interface between them, if they're an external customer group, is a different organization. Typically, you're also working with other groups that need to prioritize the work on your project. And those are external groups that the CTO doesn't control. And so just because it seems like there's a single, simple buy-in, reality is that it's a complex decision that's collaborative in nature. And so you now understand all these actors. I want you to understand the process that goes on that makes the decision that gets you buy-in. And the first thing you have to understand is how are you perceived within the business? What does the business think you do? What does the business think your value is to them? And you're going to have to ask people, like, what do you think I do here? And I know that's a kind of uncomfortable conversation to have, but it's important to understand the business's perception of you because part of buy-in might be changing their understanding of what you're capable of and how much value you can actually bring. Getting buy-in is setting expectations. And the first expectation you want to set is what do? Educate people. Teach people what it is that you're capable of doing. What is it that you can help them with? Because in a lot of cases, as soon as you say, this is what I can do, you'll get people saying, I could use your help. Enablers and evangelists. Now you have someone who's telling you, hey, I could really use help with this. And instead of you dictating terms to everyone else, now people are coming to you and saying, hey, I could use your help with this. Remember your projects that you mapped out. In most cases for me, when I do that walking around and educating people on what it is that I can do and how I can help, they'll come to me with project ideas that actually line up with projects that I already know are out there. So I've planted the seed and now I have an enabler. I have somebody that's already bought in because it was their idea. And that's a whole lot of what educating people about what I can do helps achieve. Now, understand that the business as a whole has an expectation of you. Like, why do you have a job? What is that expectation of you? Because not only do you have to think about what people think of you and think you're going to do, but also the business as a whole expects a certain level of productivity from you. And you have to meet that level of productivity or your chances of getting buy-in almost fall apart. If you spend 6 months and you don't really meet the needs of the business will very quickly start asking, why is it that we have you? And the amount of time you can get with decision makers will begin to decrease. So it's important to understand not only what does everyone think of you, what does everyone think you can do, but what does the business expect you to produce? What amount of value is the business expecting you to produce. And you got to make sure your projects line up with that, because if they don't, like I said, it doesn't matter how excited people are about having you. If you're not producing in the way that the business expects, eventually you're going to get kneecapped. Now, there are two strategies that you can use in order to get buy-in from different groups. Some groups are fear-driven, meaning they're not looking for the best alternative. They're looking to avoid the worst case. They are looking at, what if we don't do this versus what if we do it? And so they're not looking to optimize their return. They're looking to minimize their loss. And so some groups, your most effective communication is going to be, hey, if we don't do this, this is what's going to happen. And we don't always think in terms of loss when we communicate. We think in terms of gain when we communicate. But data supports both cases. So you can go either way and understand that some of the people that you're talking to are motivated by loss. Some are motivated by gain. So target your message by understanding which one is which. And in a lot of cases, workers are loss motivated, meaning they prioritize based on the worst case scenario. If we don't get this done by 3 weeks from now, we will lose 7 clients. That's loss focused. And you may have to tailor your message to make your project important by associating a loss. What happens if you don't do your project? Just as much as we talk about cost savings and revenue and positive incentives, gain. So think about that. Every audience has a different incentivization, and there's also language that goes along with that. Now, you need to create a coalition. We talked about enablers, and I've given you some tips to get to customers and get them excited about your project, because you're going to need a group of people to help you overcome all of the different barriers and help you communicate up the chain of command to get into rooms that you may not be able to get into, especially in a very large company. It's hard to get time with your CTO. It's hard to get time with the C-suite. It's even harder to get more than one senior level C-suite in the same room at the same time. It's hard. So you need a collaboration. You need a coalition of people, all of whom are going to help you. Because if you're the only one going door to door saying my project is important, it's a whole lot harder than if you're building a coalition and building other enablers and they are going and knocking on multiple doors. That's huge. So get as many people from as many teams as possible involved in pitching your project. If it's only you, if you find yourself alone on an island and you're the only one who thinks this is important, you're pitching the wrong project. Go find a different one. And no, don't give up on that project. Once you build credibility and once you build that initial coalition, it will be a whole lot easier to get your next and your next and your next approved and bought in on. And so don't be afraid of taking a lesser early success than you could possibly. Maybe it's not the best possible project, but that's okay. Build that coalition around the project that they'll support and move forward from there. Now, finally, adversaries. There are always going to be people in your way, and it's really difficult to get a coalition to go after adversaries, especially entrenched adversaries who look at you as a competitor for resources, whether that's budget or headcount. You could be an adversary to them just simply because you need the same resources that they do, and they're just as passionate about their project as you are. You have to jump step your adversaries, which means you have to go to their boss. You're not going to be able to get many people in your coalition to do that for you. Why? It's a really uncomfortable and in many cases risky proposition for other people. They're not going to stick their neck out for you as passionately as you will. And so you can't be afraid if you find a person who is basically throwing barriers in front of you, who's making it very difficult to get buy-in. You can't be afraid to go to their boss. And remember that organizational map that we created. This is a huge reason why you create that, because you understand that it is, in some cases, possible that that individual is going to be an entrenched adversary because their objectives just conflict with yours. However, at some level of their org chart, there is someone whose goals align with yours at a higher level. And you have to find that person and you have to make a very, very convincing argument for your project in order to get that person removed as a barrier. It's not always possible. Like I said, think about it before you do it and make sure you have goals that line up. But you can't be afraid to go over people's heads. And that's going to be a huge piece of you getting buy-in. Those are, like I said, some of the hardest presentations you're ever going to do, but you have to get good at them if you want to get buy-in for increasingly complex projects, especially in a very large organization. Now, you always have to go focus on results. Beyond anything else, results are going to get you buy-in faster than anything else. And if you don't have a track record, build one quick and hammer it home every single time you ask for buy-in. Talk about how other projects have succeeded and how this project will succeed in similar fashion. We have similar data to support it, similar methodologies, and really the important thing for you to understand is the longer the distance between someone making a decision, one of those decision makers saying yes, and results and feedback and positive feedback, the harder it is to maintain that coalition and keep everyone motivated in such a way that you continue to have buy-in, that you continue to get resources for the project. And if you lose that coalition, if you have a long distance, a long amount of time between everyone saying yes and a positive result, something that you can hang your hat on and say, look, we achieved something. And that's the cost savings. Remember, back to that's either the cost savings and efficiencies or the revenue. You want to structure your project in such a way that the rewards come incrementally and you get an initial upfront win that you can point at and say, look, we're already beginning to show results and here they are, and make them tangible, make them real. Like I said, cash, just talk cash, talk money. And the higher up the ranks that you get, the more interested they are in you talking money and the less interested they are in you talking about technology. So create those continuous feedback loops that you are constantly having meetings where you are talking about how this is killing it, how this is doing great, or you're sending out emails on a regular basis, status update. Guess how much we made off this project this month, or guess how close to launch we are. I mean, find some wins and keep hammering home that you're making progress and that there's money and revenue and cost savings associated with your project to keep your coalition together, to continue to have people excited and enthusiastic about the forward progress that your project is making. And again, this is key for your next project and your next project, because you don't just get buy-in once. It is something that you're continually doing throughout your career as a data scientist. Now, I want to give you a little bit of an example of a project where I had to get buy-in. Worked with a luxury brand and I was brought in. So let's talk about, why did they bring me in? Why did I get a paycheck? It's to understand a new type of luxury buyer. The millennial and younger luxury buyer has a completely different behavioral pattern and behavioral set than the buyers that they were used to. So I got brought in to understand that. So I know why I'm there. Now I had to identify my key groups and I had to identify what was a significant amount of money, because they're talking revenue. They brought me in to understand groups, not to save money, to generate revenue, to attract a new type of customer and get them to spend more. And this was an underperforming customer group. So you see how well I can describe exactly what it is that I got brought in to do. I know what I want to target as my first project type, revenue, and a significant amount of revenue, a noticeable to the business improvement in a particular customer segment. You see how granular that is? I know exactly what I'm doing. And you have to have the same level of granularity and understanding what it is that you are expected to do and how much money are you expected to either bring in or save. So who are my key groups? I went through and identified them. I got marketing, I got frontline sales, I had the e-com group, I had the product group, I had engineering, and I had the C-suite. That's a lot of people to get under one tent. And so I understood that I was going to have different approaches with each one, because I needed marketing to not only help me out, to listen and to act on the recommendations that I was making, I also needed data from them. Frontline sales, I was going to be changing the behaviors of frontline sales So I needed them bought in. I needed them bought in enough that they would actually listen to me, that they would act on my recommendations and trust that I was going to bring them some positive results. And you can hear this. I had to persuade, I had to get people on board. I had to get e-com in because we had to synchronize your storefront, your brick and mortar experience with your e-com experience to make them similar enough that millennial buyers would go from the store to online, back to the store, and again, through marketing, have a consistent relationship with the brand and consistent experiences. That's a lot of synchronization of groups that are collaborative, but not necessarily that closely collaborative. Product, obviously, because we needed to work products into each one of these sales campaigns and marketing campaigns. Engineering, because I needed a whole lot of stuff built and I was one person. So obviously I'm not going to be building everything. So I needed workers. I needed people bought in that this was a priority. And finally, I needed the C-suite. Why? You're hearing this is organizational. This isn't just a couple of business units. This is a whole thing. And I need someone at the C-suite level. In this case, it was multiple people, a CMO, CTO, who were bought in and who would back this project and get everyone in their organization on the same page in order to implement what it is that I found out. And so my quick win was something called prestige-seeking behaviors. So there are certain groups of people who are more likely to buy a luxury brand because they want the prestige. They want the increase in perception from others that they associate with them being connected with the brand, them having some things from that brand and buying from that brand. And that's called prestige-seeking behaviors. And so we had to identify people within this underperforming segment who were prestige seekers. And that was my quick win because I already had the data that I needed to identify, even though it wasn't as large of a segment within the millennial group. I already had the data from all of the other groups to understand that there are prestige seekers. And so I went to the millennial group and figured out what were prestige seeking indicators. What features could I use to predict a prestige seeker and target marketing more effectively to convert buyers so that they didn't go and prestige seek someplace else, so that they spent their money with our luxury brand, not someone else's. And so I had to do data acquisition rapidly. I had to identify quickly, use that data to identify and target prestige seekers rapidly. We did some amazing marketing campaigns and incentives to get a very quick win. Within a month, we were seeing an improved response to marketing and increased revenue within that key group. And so it was quick. It was rapid. 1 month. I was able to start showing results. And of course, once I do that, now I have a track record so that I can come back and point to that and say, no, we're going to continue with this project. Why? Well, look at the gains I've already gotten you. Look at what I did last month. Look at what I did last quarter. This is worth continuing, and here's why. So now my narrative has some tangible results. Now I have some reason why, like I'm rewarding you for buying in. Thank you so much. Here are some things that your annual goals are based on, and I've helped you achieve those goals. And I had regular meetings. I mean, we met monthly by group, and we talked about relevant metrics, and I drove home the fact that this was working and we should continue, that there are next steps. And I made a very clear call to action. Like, this is what I need you to keep doing for me in order for us to maintain this momentum. I kept the coalition together. Those groups of people who were saying, oh, wow, this is really working for me. And those early adopters, those people who helped me out early on, who said, this is my goal, this is my mission, as CTO and CMO. I made sure that every 2 weeks I was sitting down with them and understanding that what I was doing was still positive and helpful to them. And when I felt like they weren't as enthusiastic as they were before, I knew it was time to up the game. We needed to get bigger results to keep them engaged and on board. And that's the point of these regular meetings. It's to keep everyone who was on board at the beginning engaged and to continue to bring new people into the tent by showing results that were impactful to them. And that's buy-in. It's a whole lot of stuff that they don't teach you in your data science classes. It's almost politicking. It's almost salesperson-ish, but it's incredibly important. Why? Because you're going to spend your whole career trying to do increasingly complex, but also increasingly valuable projects. That's where the real value of a data scientist shines. And it's not only good for the company, it's also good for you in your career to be able to have these portfolio projects that you can point at and start building your reputation with. And so buy-in is something you're going to do throughout your career. And it's really poorly understood until you really look at it from the perspective of who has to buy in. And from a business standpoint, what interests them? So, buy-in. Always keep it in the back of your mind. Always understand that you're selling your projects and you will be extraordinarily valuable to the business.